Welcome to Inside Criminal Minds, the series dissecting the FBI's elite team of profilers. If you are new to the channel, welcome, and there is a playlist to the other videos linked in the description. If you've been here before, sit back, relax as we get derailed. Today's episode begins with JJ discussing Elle with Hotch, as Elle is doing a custodial interview with a serial killer by herself, which this really shows Elle's journey from barely making it onto the BAU team to being a lot more independent and doing interviews solo. In the next scene, we learn the backstory of everyone on the train. One of the biggest problems in this episode, because showing the problems before we actually meet the characters doesn't give us that same emotional reaction when things happen, but since now we know who all the people are, let's do a rundown. So first we have a drunk washout, a pregnant woman, and a businessman with a failing marriage, possibly on the train to kill his ex and commit suicide. Ugh. And finally, a notable psychologist who is taking one of her patients, Ted, to a conference in Dallas. We then see Elle studying the case file for a conclusive interview when Elle calls Gideon for some reassurance and possibly some tips about the interview moving forward. And this scene really does show us, the viewers, that there is no cell service, which is mainly the reason why she called him. And this is also a time where Elle calls Gideon Dad, which is foreshadowing for a future scene. And then we finally get a view of our unsub, who is our first disorganized criminal on the show. If you need to know about organized versus disorganized, go watch my video. It's episode 5, and I go in depth more about what the difference is between a disorganized and an organized serial killer. But we find out that Ted is a schizophrenic who is paranoid about the federal agent on board, but furthering his paranoia, after the train suddenly stops due to a suicide jumper, the security guard stops to talk to Elle, and interestingly, we see a character that we didn't get a backstory for that we later learn is Leo, pointing out that the FBI agent and the security guard are whispering, alluding to the fact that he isn't actually going to a conference. He's actually being put away into a different mental institution. Now, knowing that Ted thinks that he's going to be taken away, he decides to act. First, he takes out the security guard and takes his weapon, shooting him in the process. Next, he overpowers Elle, chains her to her seat, and takes her gun. And this is where we get a glimpse of Ted's schizophrenia, because nobody else acknowledges Leo talking, which I believe is a very nice touch for the directors. Next, we see the BAU be presented this case due to Ted's condition, and this is a great Google Reid moment.
Tardive dyskinesia.
Once more for those of us without an encyclopedic memory.
Severe facial tics, the kind that develop after years of taking antipsychotic medication.
And also, Gideon sees Elle giving a personal aspect to this case, which makes it seem like they shouldn't be on the case. They should let somebody else give it a chance. In fact, in a future episode, you learn that there are different teams of BAU, just this is the team that we follow. However, the team does make it to Texas, and right before they get to the actual scene, Gideon, after hearing parts of this unsub's delusion, decides to show a sign of force by letting the sirens ring, honking, trying to get people out of their way, and so on. Basically trying to dominate the crime scene. And when the BAU show up to the train, Gideon states that they shouldn't be looking at the train, basically to show the unsub that the higher authority does not care about the people on the train, but every single person who is in the BAU decides to look at the train anyway. Weird. And also, Garcia is tasked to run facial recognition software against the people on the train to gain some information about them. Unfortunately, that's not how facial recognition really works, because you basically, if you don't have a shot that is straight on with good lighting, you're not going to be able to figure out who those people are. Oh well, movie magic. Anyway, the people on the train figure out that the redhead is pregnant. Due to the morning sickness, business, and for some reason the businessman reaches into his briefcase to pull out his Bible. I guess this is what the directors wanted people to see, or at least think, that he was pulling out his gun by showing us his backstory, but the scene would have still been as tense, or even more tense, even without the backstory. Next, we learn that there is a SWAT team on standby, and if things get dicey and Ted decides to basically end it all, that they will be in place to take over the train. After that, Ted grabs the pregnant woman to talk to the higher authority, potentially hiding his identity to them. Elle does try and fails at becoming a martyr for this task because Ted believes that Elle will send hidden messages, and this is when Gideon assumes the role of the higher authority by becoming extremely mysterious, and after a couple of questions to the pregnant lady, Ted is forced by Gideon to talk on the phone, showing Gideon's skill at interrogation and the ability to profile someone with little to no interactions. But this interchange brings up a question of what kind of delusion Ted has, because he wants something removed and tries to negotiate a way to get it removed, buying our team an hour to figure out what's going on. And this is when Leo, basically his guiding compass throughout this whole ordeal, goats him into continuing his venture. Then we get the washed out drunk to argue with Ted about the heat in the train, prompting Ted to lash out. Thankfully, the psychologist calms him down to avoid further bloodshed, but also reveal Ted's arms to the security camera to shed light on what Ted wants removed. Meanwhile, Garcia miraculously finds the IDs of the people on the train. However, most of this stuff is things we already know, except for the unsub, who we find out is Dr. Theodore Breyer, a genius like John Nash, the guy from A Beautiful Mind, which is referenced in this episode. After Gideon gets the rundown of the hostages, we learn a little bit more about the doctor's delusion, and when the drunk finds out about it, he tries to convince the doctor that the drunk isn't part of any government by quoting 1984, but instead of consoling the doctor, the drunk just makes it worse. The doctor becomes more aggressive, believing the drunk is just making fun of him. And now we get my favorite part of the episode, which is Magic Reid. So this is the first time that we get backstory on Reid as a magician. He spent a lot of his life learning prestidigitation, and now it is the saving grace of this episode. Now, this isn't the last time we're gonna see his magic, and in one episode it really makes me mad, but we'll get into that later. But this is when they figure out a way to extract the microchip from Dr. Breyer by using sleight of hand. However, Morgan tries to prevent Reid from going on the train, which could be looked at in two ways. First way, Morgan doesn't want his friend in the line of fire, which is admirable. The second way is that Morgan assumes that Reid is too weak to carry on this mission. I personally like the first one because it strengthens the relationship of Reid and Morgan, and I appreciate that, especially in the future episodes where Reid and Morgan become closer than brothers. Ultimately, Reid is the one to go on the train because the team determines that Morgan cannot perform the trick well enough to complete it. Next, in the first scene with CGI, we see the psychologist try to break the doctor's resolve, which does seem to work until his delusions get the best of him and he points the gun at the psychologist, prompting Elle to threaten the doctor to not get the chip taken out if he hurts somebody else on this train, which effectively de-escalates the situation and really shows how much Elle has learned from being in the BAU. After Gideon calls the unsub pushes the deadline ahead by 20 minutes, forcing Reid to learn this complicated trick almost immediately, but not before Morgan delivers dialogue about SWAT teams and how he shouldn't act like he knows Elle because he's a tech. And we get a pretty funny scene with Reid.
Remember, play into the guy's fantasy, believe it yourself.
Actually, did you know that dentists and surgeons have been recruited to secretly implant these during otherwise normal medical procedures? This has been happening on and off since the late 1930s. Told me to believe.
And then another funny scene.
Could you guys do me a favor?
Anything.
Could at least one of you look like you're gonna see me again?
See you when you get back.
Next, Reid enters the train in order to extract the microchip, but not before the doctor takes the pregnant woman hostage to force Reid to take off his bulletproof vest. Next, we see Reid performing the procedure to help Dr. Breyer, removing the palmed chip. However, the doctor wants the chip turned on, and Reid freezes. Luckily, Elle does step in and help him with a pretty convincing cover story, and this does further Reid's character development because in future episodes, Reid is a lot more confident and shows that even under major stress, he can perform very well. It also shows how capable Elle is and that she really deserves to be on this team. Meanwhile, Hotch is with the SWAT team discussing exit strategy. After the removal of the chip, Gideon attempts to call, but Leo encourages the doctor that the higher authorities is still bothering him, prompting the drunk to lash out, escalating the doctor to shoot, and mistakenly shoots the psychologist. Then the doctor finally picks up the phone, but bad news for the FBI because the doctor wants to kill the hostages and himself due to the word choices that Dr. Breyer is using. After this phone call, Dr. Breyer shoots the phone to stop all communications with Gideon, showing us the doctor is completely done with negotiating with Gideon. However, Gideon does retaliate by setting the SWAT team ready to infiltrate. Next, the doctor complains about the ringing in his ears, telling Leo that after the chip was removed, it was supposed to stop. But Leo starts to lie to the doctor, driving a wedge between the two of them. Reid does take advantage of this by explaining to the doctor how Reid knows the doctor feels. And interestingly, Leo isn't shown for the rest of the episode, showing us that the doctor's sanity is returning and what Reid is doing is working by driving a bigger wedge between the doctor and Leo. And after this, Reid gains the doctor's faith and using this trust to flip the tables on Leo, making him less honest. Next, Reid explains how the doctor figured out all of his mathematical and scientific theories, mirroring Reid's fight in his youth, being a genius. This leads us to the second CGI scene, which is notably a lot worse than the first one because Reid gets turned into a spaghetti monster. So yeah, that's the thing. Anyway, this does lead to a struggle where the business guy eventually shoots the doctor, thankfully ending the unsub's control over the train. After the excitement, Dr. Breyer and the psychologist go to the hospital, and Elle is forced by Gideon to go as well. But not before we get a scene with Elle calling Gideon dad again, which Gideon shoots down almost immediately, telling her not to call him that ever again. But lastly, we get an immensely cute scene with Elle and Reid.
Reid, you probably saved my life in there.
Probably? I totally saved your life. And I'm pretty certain that it was caught on tape.
You know what you said in there to Breyer? That you know what it's like?
The guy was a delusional psychotic. I was playing into his fantasy.
Furthering my idea of them becoming a couple in the future. That does end the episode, and this was a great episode focusing on Elle and Reid's ability to survive a hostage situation, thinking on their feet, and proving that they're not just a smart person and a hot chick. And this was Elle's second major trauma, which will be brought up more in future episodes. Also shows us how much Gideon cares for his team. Now, you may have noticed a change of scenery. This is thanks to M. Ferrari. He did a great job of drawing my new avatar, and if you're in the market for somebody to do really good work, I highly recommend him. I will be putting his Fiverr account link in the description. Next week, we're going to deal with Satanists and popular kids. Thank you for watching. Please